Hello everyone, and welcome to our screencast that will provide some background context for studying mythology. My hope is that in the next few minutes you're going to learn a little bit of background on mythological studies and how some different lenses might help us approach the myths and interpret them in different ways. So let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing that I'd like you to do is please, as you watch this screencast, have your notebook out. Take notes, jot down some key takeaways as you run through the screencast. It could be anything that stands out in your memory that you think might be important. Also feel free to pause the screencast if you need a little bit more time to process. Answer the questions when prompted. Pause, rewind, replay at any time. At the end of this screencast, you want to have at least 2 things that are important that you want to share with the class when we come back together on Tuesday. So here we go. First off, if I were to say to you, that's a myth, would I mean that's a falsehood, or would I mean that is a universal truth? I want you to think carefully about that. Think about what you see in the news and the media, and if someone says, that's a myth, do they mean that it's fake news, or do they mean that it is true news? We're going to come back to this question through the course of the semester, and I'm going to ask that you revisit it at the end of the screencast as well. But for now, take a side, choose which one you think is more appropriate. Let's go on. What is mythology? First question. I'd like you to jot down your definition of what a myth is. In your notebook, just jot down, a myth is, and go ahead and pause this recording right now and jot down whatever comes to mind. Now, once you're done jotting down your definition, compare it to this definition that comes out of a book. A myth is a story typically involving supernatural beings or forces which provides an explanation or justification for something such as the early history of a society, a religious belief, or ritual, or just a natural phenomenon. So that runs the gamut. You can tell that myths can involve many different types of subject matter. We're going to see how that definition compares to your own. Do you see any similarities? Are there any echoes? Are there any matches? Let's dig a little deeper. So why do people create myths? And when you think of it, some of the myths that we're going to be talking about are literally thousands and thousands of years old. So in some ways, myths are central to the human condition, the stories we create. Why is that the case? Why do people create myths? Well, they sometimes do to provide an understanding of the world around us and its origin. Why are we here? Why do we exist on this planet? Oftentimes, myths can set codes and provide guidance for behavior. These are the myths that give us morals and lessons where we're supposed to learn from the main characters and try to emulate, act as they do, or avoid the mistakes that they make. Sometimes myths help us deal with our unconscious fears and desires. They create characters who act larger than life, an exaggeration of maybe our primal feelings, things that we might think about but never act upon. And we see these gods, these divinities, act on them in a way that enables us to see what would happen if I. We also have myths to explain religious rites and ceremonies. In the far right corner, you'll see a frieze that depicts the Eleusinian mysteries. We'll talk about them this year. And they're an elaborate secret ritual. Myths arose to explain some of the rituals that took place therein. And then lastly, we create myths to entertain and amuse. So what I'd like you to do right now is pause the screencast and decide which of these 5 things most resonates with you and maybe matches the definition that you came up with. Take a moment. Think about what stands out for you, and when you're ready, you can move on. So how do people study myths? As I mentioned at the beginning, we're going to be looking at different lenses that people use to approach the stories and help them interpret some of the deeper meaning. What kinds of lenses can we use? Well, think about it for a second, and then you can move on. There are certain ways of studying myth that mythologists from the dawn of time have approached in terms of trying to understand some of the meaning therein. You might take, for instance, an anthropological lens, and this is looking at myths to understand the cultures of primitive societies. We might look at some of the famous ancient gods and try to look at, for instance, Heracles as an ancient warrior. We might look at the myths surrounding Demeter as explaining agricultural myths or rituals surviving that. So it's trying to use the story to understand a culture of the past. Now, another way to look at lens is through a strictly historical lens. So, for instance, we might look at myths to help us understand some of the history, some of the events that happened, maybe before writing was even invented, but stories were created to establish who the leader or founder of a particular city might be. You might take, for instance, when looking at myth, a psychological lens. And that's looking at myths to understand or explain psychological behavior. If we see the way the characters interact, we might learn something about human nature. This is where the hero story comes in and a few other motifs that we'll study through the course of the year. And then lastly, you can take a literary lens. I mean, that's what English classes are all about, right? Trying to understand some of the theme, the plot, the development, and some of the emotions that we get from looking at a piece of literature. So we'll be using all 4 lenses in our approach to myth studies this semester. And we're going to take a little bit of a check for understandings. I'm going to show you 3 pictures, and I'd like you to guess which lens has most often been applied to the myth. So here we go. Here's the first one. It is the story or the myth of Romulus and Remus. Which approach have historians or mythologists taken to this particular myth? I might have given it away right there. You can go ahead and write that down in your notebook. Our next example is the story of Oedipus and Jocasta. Now, in this particular myth, Oedipus kills his father and marries his mother. We spoke a little bit about this in our game earlier in the week. Which lens might help us interpret some of the dynamics of this myth? And then lastly, we're going to see some artifacts of fertility goddesses. On the left-hand side, you see the Venus of Willendorf, one of the oldest found artifacts, 24,000 before the Common Era. And on the right, you see some Neolithic fertility goddesses as well. And these were created by very early societies, and we think they depict mother goddesses. And if you look at the robust figure and also the emphasis on fertility parts of the body, her breasts and her sexual organs, this might reflect that the goddess or the woman was very revered as a mother goddess entity in primitive societies. So what lens should we look at to try and interpret this myth depicted by the artifact? Now, I'm guessing you probably have these right. Check and see if you made the connection. Usually, Romulus and Remus myth is taken a historical approach, the founding of Rome. When we get back together, I'll tell you that myth. It's a great one. It involves wolves. Oedipus and Jocasta, oftentimes mythologists will take a psychological approach to look at the way that young men form attachments and then subsequent detachments with their moms. And we take an anthropological lens when we look at the Venus of Willendorf. Now, it's less important that you remember these actual terms than you just are comfortable with these lenses as tools. So you're going to dive in and enter into a myth, kind of trying to figure out something about the culture, the complex human interactions, the history, or maybe just what the literature is telling us. Why study myth today? All right, final question. Why are we in this class? Well, you shared some reasons why you signed up for mythology earlier in the week. And mythologists today will look at ancient and more recent mythologies in order to identify universal truths. What are some of the things that we as humans share? What are some of the feelings, emotions, cultural artifacts that are common? We study mythology to help us understand elements of our own human psychology. For instance, we'll look at the story of the Minotaur and the Labyrinth to help us understand the way we ourselves work out of problems and mazes that we may feel stuck in. Studying mythology allows us to understand the values of a society or culture, and hopefully, most of all, studying mythology is fun. So, with this background in mind, I want you to think again about what you said to the earlier question I posed. That's a myth means that's a falsehood? Or does that mean it's a universal truth? We'll debate this on Tuesday when we meet again, and I want you to come with some reasons why you believe your particular stance. What's your takeaway? So I'd like you to jot down 2 things that you take away as key ideas from the background information presented in the screencast. Be prepared to share them in class on Tuesday, and also be prepared to explain whether you think that's a myth means it's a falsehood or a universal truth. And then we're going to dive right into some of the creation stories. So thanks for watching, everyone. As always, contact me if you need anything, and have a great rest of the weekend. Bye-bye.